Today on Reparations in Action.
To take this lesson that the system of colonial capitalism and the contradictions that come from it is not a permanent situation. And you can just take that from the Battle of St. Peter 96 to the struggles happening around the world. This system, the time is ticking.
You're listening to Reparations in Action.
Reparations now!
Uhuru. You're listening to the Reparations in Action podcast and FM radio show, the White Lies Shattered series. My name is Jamie Simpson. White Lies Shattered is a program of reparations in action exposing the insidious lies we tell ourselves as white or European people about the nature and origin of America and the current social system. We believe reparations to African people is the key question of our times and is one that demands action on the part of European or white people. As always, we'd like to salute Black Power 96, where this show is aired and recorded for our podcast weekly. Today is a special edition of Reparations in Action, marking 25 years since the murder of TyRon Lewis by police in St. Petersburg. On October 24th, 1996, TyRon Lewis, an 18-year-old African man, was shot to death in broad daylight by police during a traffic stop at an intersection just a few blocks away from the Uhuru House, which is also the local headquarters of the African People's Socialist Party. There were over 100 witnesses to this heinous colonial murder. The African community then rose up in a courageous and fierce rebellion against the police and the entire system of colonial oppression in St. Petersburg. These rebellions lasted throughout the night of October 24th. Then on November 13th, 1996, the grand jury exonerated police officers James Knight and Sandra Minor of any wrongdoing in the murder of TyRon Lewis. As soon as news of this exoneration became public, police swarmed the Uhuru House, arresting members of the Uhuru Movement for things like expired license plates. Chairman of the African People's Socialist Party, Akilé Anai, and other Uhuru Movement leaders were pepper sprayed by the police outside of the Uhuru House as the entire African community came into the streets and watched in disgust. The International People's Democratic Uhuru Movement was holding its regular Wednesday night meeting that night of November 13th, 1996, and the police cut off the flow of traffic to the Uhuru House to this meeting and began intimidating the community and preventing people from attending the meeting. Shortly after Chairman Akilé Anai began this Wednesday night meeting of the Uhuru Movement, there were over 100 men, women, and children in the auditorium, and the police declared the meeting an illegal gathering and began attacking people inside and outside of the auditorium with incendiary tear gas canisters that eventually set a tree and van behind the Uhuru House on fire. This fire threatened the entire building and the lives of everyone inside. The African community then rose up for a second time in armed guerrilla warfare against over 300 police who were armed to the teeth. The African working class community members extinguished the fire at the Uhuru House and fought the police in a fierce armed resistance that eventually forced 2 police helicopters to land and a small police airplane to leave the airspace over St. Petersburg. The colonial police were forced to withdraw from the African community, and a transcript of the police communication that night was published in the local newspaper the next day and had the commander saying, "Pull back the troops, we're under heavy fire." The TyRon Lewis Rebellion of October 24th, 1996, and the November 13th Battle of St. Petersburg ended in an absolute victory for the African working class that forever changed the city and marked a serious defeat for the global system of colonial capitalism. In St. Petersburg, this meant that the balance of power between the state, meaning the city government and the police, and the African working class was forever altered. For 8 years after the murder of TyRon Lewis, no African person in St. Petersburg was murdered by police. The Uhuru Movement was recognized as the unquestioned and legitimate leadership of the African working class, and all charges against Uhuru Movement leaders and members were dropped. This was an unprecedented victory for the African working class and the African Revolution. The following is a section of the documentary The Battle of St. Pete and the Struggle for Black Power, produced by Robert Wyrud of the Fred Hampton Uhuru House in 1998.
He was young, he was black, and he was shot for no reason, dog. And that's real. The man was shot for no reason, we wouldn't be doing all this today. How you think my mom looking at the news live? It could have been me, you know? It could have been me. How you think my mom? I know my mom feel every day that I'm going to get shot or something, you know?
Because of the Uhuru Movement's 30-year history of organizing for black rights in St. Petersburg and throughout the country, we were able to provide political leadership and a voice for the demands of the African working class of St. Petersburg, enabling the community to respond powerfully to the police murder of TyRon Lewis through 2 major rebellions and countless direct action mobilizations. Within 1 year of the initial rebellion, the Uhuru Movement has forced both the city government and the federal government to respond to the African community's demand for economic development and social justice, and taken the struggle for black power to a new level. We in the Uhuru Movement believe that this struggle in St. Petersburg is indicative of a growing resistance in African communities throughout this country. We hope that this program will be of value to organizers working to promote black power for the African community.
They murdered TyRon Lewis. It was supposed to be just another day at Africa. That's what it was supposed to be. The state's response to the murder and to the immediate resistance that emerged was typical. But you need to know that the resistance was not typical. What happened in St. Petersburg was incredible for its advanced character. The advanced character of the resistance in St. Petersburg was striking. People all around the country, even with the garbage that was coming to the Chicago Sun-Times, and somebody who wrote that article, somebody showed it to me when I got here, somebody who wrote the article in the Chicago Sun-Times just went into a room someplace and said, why don't we say this? And then wrote something and said, why don't we say, and wrote something because it had no relationship to the real world. But the thing is that people, even through the bourgeois media, were able to see the advanced character of the struggle that happened in St. Petersburg, Florida. And it was advanced because even though there were waves of people in the streets, the thing that was so striking about St. Petersburg wasn't just burning and looting, so to speak, but there were what they like to refer to in this country when they're murdering people in Iraq and other places is there were surgical strikes that saw police precincts, 2 police precincts in the African community destroyed. That saw police cars burned on the spot. Saw media vehicles burned on the spot. Saw blood-sucking, filthy, parasitic merchants, many of them been in the community for 20, 30, 40, 50 years. Only role they play in the community is come there to pick up money. And as soon as they get it, they stay there long enough to exhaust the supply of money for the day. Then they take the money and leave and come back the next day to get the money. And while people may have thought the masses were sleeping and didn't understand the role of these forces, they did clearly understand their role. And they went to burn to the ground. And it happened so quickly that the ruling class were writing about how that happened and how somebody must have planned it. And somebody must have made it happen like that. And of course, what happened is that the Uhuru Movement, in one form or another, has been in St. Petersburg, Florida for 30 years. An unbroken history, 30 years in that same community, an unbroken history. And it has been 30 years of political education, sometimes less effective than others, because the last thing I would want to do is paper over the contradictions in our movement, because there are contradictions which permeate our movement in St. Petersburg and throughout the country. But in St. Petersburg, there was consistent struggle to reach out to the masses. So the people rose up and made a magnificent response to the murder of TyRon Lewis. The response of the state to the murder of TyRon Lewis was never to reprimand the police. There was no intent ever to say the police might have done something wrong, or to say that there were any kind of underlying social contradictions which may have also contributed to the rebellion that occurred on October 24th. The response of the state, of the government, with the help of the ruling class media, was first to slander TyRon Lewis, because you know he did have a criminal record. And he was speeding. And there was some crack we found in the car after he was killed. So that was the first thing they did. Secondly, the response was to isolate and criminalize the Uhuru Movement for inciting the rebellion. Never, never, never did they intend to say, well, maybe the police acted improperly. Maybe there are some kind of underlying social contradictions here responsible for the rebellion. Their response was to slander that brother, to isolate and criminalize our movement, and then to indict us, to send us to prison. That was their response, immediately. But they were unsuccessful in doing that. They were unsuccessful because we pushed the democratic question successfully.
Justice! We want it now! What do we want? Justice! When we want it now! What do we want? Justice! When we want it now! No peace! No justice! No peace! No peace! No peace! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace! No peace! No justice! No peace! No justice! No peace!
Woke up this morning with my mind. Oh, freedom. Uhuru. 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 We're here to say that we're uniting, demanding justice. And when do we want justice?
Right now!
Now! Right. We want the release of our brothers out of those jails. We definitely want the military to move, and that's what it is. It's the military.
That's right.
We want them out of here now.
That's
We
right.
want justice.
That's right. That's right.
We found unanimously that both officers, James Knight and Sandra Mana, are guilty of murder. We found, we weren't asked to do this, but we felt it was part of our responsibility, that both officers, James Knight and Sandra Mana, are sentenced to death in the state electric chair. We also found that both Mayor David Fisher and Chief Darrell Stevens are found guilty of murder in that the city's official policy was carried out as an execution on behalf of the city.
That was the Uhuru Movement produced Battle of St. Pete, the documentary available on YouTube. I had the honor of speaking to the director of agitation and propaganda for the African People's Socialist Party, Akilé Anai, on this 25-year anniversary of the murder of TyRon Lewis and the rebellions that followed. We began by talking about the relationship between the police and the African community in 1996.
Uhuru, yeah, I think the first thing we can say about the relationship between the police and the African community in St. Pete during that time, and it's the same relationship that's been carried on for centuries since African people's colonial enslavement and capture and being brought to this land, which is characterized as the U.S. today. And that really sets the stage for the relationship that African people had with the police in '96 and the relationship that we have with them today, where the police is a colonial military occupying force within the African community to maintain the relationship of the colonizer and the colonized, where the colonizer has all of this wealth at the expense of the poor and impoverished African working class colonized population. And the city of St. Pete is we have to say that because the city of St. Petersburg is no different from the rest of the settler colony of the U.S. And it participates in this global process. So the scene at that time in '96, especially following what they were doing to this community with the process of gentrification, erecting a baseball dome after destroying a Black community called the Gas Plant District. That the murder of TyRon Lewis was a consequence of this city sanitizing, this community, this area, this prime real estate for the development, the expansion of the white community in this city, and the tourist economy and things of that nature. So the murder of TyRon Lewis, this 18-year-old African, was again, a process of colonial gentrification, removing African people out of this community, making examples of African people. It was just it's a continued relationship, and the Africans can't be here in order for the white population to continue to move here. So that's what we were seeing. I mean, there were a lot of different attacks, assaults being made on the African community during this stretch of time, and TyRon Lewis was a part of that.
Under colonialism, there is nothing unusual about the police murdering African people in broad daylight. What was not routine about the rebellion that followed the murder of TyRon Lewis was the politically conscious nature of the resistance that followed.
Yeah, I think that what you stated in just the beginning there about, TyRon Lewis, I mean, this is a common practice of colonialism. Africans are killed by the state every single day for the benefit and the maintenance of the social system. So TyRon Lewis in and of itself, wasn't this anomaly, but it was this organized military response from the African working class that made it so different. And that and as I was mentioned, it's routine to kill African people. And it happens on a day-to-day basis, and there isn't always an uprising or rebellion that occurs. So this city was, and it's important to note, too, that, Chairman Amalia Shachela, who was born here, who had been organizing here since the 60s, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with the formation of the Hunt of militant organizations, tearing down this white nationalist mural that hung in the city of St. Pete in 1966, and then the birth of the party, the African People's Socialist Party, in 1972, that all of this was leading up to the organized resistance of the African working class in the city of St. Pete. And that's why it was different. It was different because African people had political leadership on the ground, and that really encouraged the rebellion, that gave people the consciousness to know that what has just occurred is, an act that, is that expects our expects us to just lay down and accept it, to take it as reality. And the state got a totally different response, which had occurred over decades of political leadership and ideological development happening on behalf of the Black Liberation Movement, and in particular, the African People's Socialist Party that had been here, had for decades, had the benefit of the leadership of the chairman, and had organizers on the ground prior to the murder of TyRon Lewis to really saturate our communities with the understanding of this relationship that African people have with the state, with the police, being able to recognize, identify those forces and their responsibility in maintaining the oppression of our community. And yeah, that's what made it so significant. That's why we're able to recall TyRon Lewis 25 years later, because people rose up in defense of TyRon Lewis and our entire African community and said, you will not get to kill us and expect for us not to do anything, to expect us not to respond and to defend our community. That day, those days are over. That's what was different in 1996.
I asked director Akilé to tell us how the Uhuru movement became inextricably tied to the uprisings and identified as the political leadership of these rebellions.
Well, I mentioned, the history of the Black Power movement in the city of St. Petersburg in particular, and that that all laid the ground, I believe, for 1996. And identified as a political leadership of the rebellion. The Uhuru movement has been the political leadership, in this city, throughout this country and throughout the world, for decades, since our existence, or since our founding in 1972. The fact of the matter is that such leadership, we've been void such leadership, since the defeat of the Black Power movement in the 60s. And the leadership of Chairman Amalia Shatella and the Uhuru movement, it kept the Black Power movement alive. And we were the only forces to claim that in this city. Nobody was touching that. The African petty bourgeoisie, the neo-colonial stooges weren't claiming what we were, which is fighting for Black power and self-determination and continuing on that trajectory. And that's how the Uhuru movement distinguishes itself among all of these formations and organizations that come into existence in response to the people rising up in order to pacify, in order to redirect the energies and the attention of the African working class. So the Uhuru movement was totally distinguished between all of that. And the Uhuru movement had been doing work before the murder of TyRon Lewis, after the murder of TyRon Lewis, in our communities, holding community mass meetings and events, having opportunities for African people to engage in building our own economic capacity. The Uhuru movement was doing all of this. And following the murder of TyRon Lewis, before the verdict came out on November 13th, the Uhuru movement organized, sessions where the people were summing up what was going on. And what happened on November 13th, when the non-indictment of these two killer cops who killed TyRon Lewis, the Uhuru movement was organizing a rally or meeting then to discuss the verdict. And it was that point where that rebellion broke out because of the state-initiated attack on the Uhuru movement during that time. So we were passing out flyers, our propaganda, everywhere, salting the earth, being able to define this narrative, this reality for the African working class, but for everyone in the city that was witnessing what had just happened with the murder of TyRon Lewis, and continued after that to provide strategic leadership after the display of, guerrilla warfare on November 13th. The party never stopped. The Uhuru movement never stopped. That wasn't the end. We continued to organize and build, from that incredible act of African resistance in 1996. So, the political leadership of the Uhuru movement was ours to seize. We were the only ones. the last man standing, if you will.
Chairman Omali Yeshitela has stated that the city or the state first tried to politically isolate the Uhuru movement, and when that failed, they sought a military victory and got their behinds kicked by the people, meaning they were militarily defeated by serious guerrilla warfare on the part of the African working class. I asked Director Akilé to tell us, in her view, what was the relationship between that military victory the African community won in pushing back 300 armed to the teeth police on November 13th, 1996, and the political tactics that the African People's Socialist Party used, such as intervening to influence the coalition of African American leadership and holding an African Community People's Tribunal, which found James Knight and Sandra Minor guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced them to death. I asked her to speak to that military victory against the state and whether or not it was a consequence of this political strategy.
Absolutely. I think that the political leadership and strategy of the Uhuru movement during that time was critical, and that without it, such a victory wouldn't have been possible. And in fact, we see Africans getting gunned down, and we see Africans rising up. But the thing that lacks there is the lack of political leadership that salted that earth. That the people had the benefit of. So what happens most often when these situations happen with the murder of George Floyd, with the murder of Mike Brown, is that in that absence of political leadership, the people are engaged in rising up and demonstrating, but where does it go? And there's no define to what end. And the system deploys the neo-colonial forces, the white power and black face, these careerists who make something of themselves through make something of themselves through appearing after the murders of African people by the police. So without that political leadership, the people are we know we're angry. We know we want to do something about it. But we have no, if there's no general understanding of, who the enemy is and what it is we're confronted with, then how do you fight back? How do you know how to fight back? And in the African working class community here in St. Petersburg had the benefit of that. We had the benefit of knowing who the enemy was and what the contradiction we were confronted with. And that allowed for the African working class to immediately jump into action. Again, the state initiated its attack on the African working class when they attempted to isolate the Uhuru movement. They attempted to kill leaders of our movement. They were conducting preemptive moves against our people, arresting members of our movement, things like that, already trying to prepare for this type of outcome. And but the African working class was very clear at that point, and was able to just again jump into action and use all the means that we had. And it was the conviction, of the African working class that you see in, struggles of like Vietnam, like that type of conviction, that political leadership that was responsible for their victory and kicking out not just one, but two imperialist colonialist forces from Vietnam. And it's the same thing we see even in this year with Afghanistan. It's the conviction, the unity with, the ideological, line and the need for independence. That is, what really makes it possible for the colonized to be victorious in the face of such military might, like that in which the city of St. Pete tried to enforce on the African community. But it didn't stand a chance. It didn't stand a chance against, at that point in time, nearly 2-3 decades of political leadership of the Uhuru movement and the unity that the people had with this movement. That's what led to the military victory of the African working class, because we don't have the military arsenal that the state has. But, we have something that the state doesn't have, which is the desire, by any means necessary, to be free.
25 years after the murder of TyRon Lewis and a year and a half after the murder of George Floyd, I asked director Akilé to tell us where she thinks the African community of St. Petersburg stands in its struggle for Black power, and what lessons she thinks this generation of revolutionaries can learn from the Battle of St. Pete.
Yeah, I think that 25 years later, one thing that, we have to understand that the conditions of our people are far worse today than they were 25 years ago, than they were 50 years ago. Despite the idea of progress made by Africans in this country and in this city. Just recently, an African man was elected as mayor of the city of St. Pete for the first time in history, and it's this thing that's celebrated. And this first of all, when you really look at it, that African man who is a neo-colonial stooge, there's that's just what that is. But this person wouldn't have even been couldn't have been elected, without the influence of the Uhuru movement. And I mean that in the sense that even the idea of St. Pete being progressive and having to move in that direction, that's in response to the types of organizing that the Uhuru movement has done, since our founding and since we've been organizing here in this city. That it's had to make those moves, and I wouldn't say those are concessions necessarily, but it's had to make these meager attempts to speak to the oppression of African people, to acknowledge that it exists. And of course they have no ability or no interest to overturn that relationship that they have with our community. But it's just important to note that things like that, they're moving towards, or they're speaking to in terms of progress and things like that for African people. It's because of the pressure that's been applied through the leadership of the Uhuru movement and the organizing of the African working class community here. But with seeing all of that, we can't make the mistake of believing that the conditions of our people have gotten better. The fact of the matter is, the city of St. Pete has been involved in, over the last several decades, a serious process of colonial gentrification and removing African people out of the city. And that's strategic for multiple reasons, and the least of which is for white developers to make all of these resources at our expense. But you remove a population who recall what happened here in '96, and bring in a population that has no idea about the history of Black power in this city. And that includes the white population, the colonizer population who comes here from, every other, place in this country to come here, to retire here, to get their beach home. And they have no idea about the history that occurred here. So, but the Uhuru movement, the African People's Socialist Party, is here in St. Petersburg. And, our presence has grown to, create these really important dual and contending power economic institutions in our community, and continuously challenging the ruling class, and providing political leadership in our community, and will not allow for what the city is doing to sweep murders of people like TyRon Lewis under the rug, that, the ruling class here will not go unchallenged, that we've met them in every arena, including the electoral arena, which they've typically dominated. We've met them there, forced reparations to be on the ballot, and they've had to deal with that. So, they're up against a lot, because, there is a lot of pressure on the state, the government, and particularly around the questions of reparations, the Tropicana Field Dome, and the future of that. There's a lot of pressure on them, and it's coming from the African community, and that's a result of years of political leadership of the Uhuru movement. And I think that we have to take this as a really important lesson, the Battle of St. Pete, a really important lesson, a profound example of what the African working class can achieve with its own revolutionary party, with that political leadership, that the African working class is mighty, and that it has the ability, we can win, and we are winning, despite all the odds, despite our conditions that are imposed on us, that the African working class, has this capacity to overturn this system, which for some people, I don't know how today because of the crisis that you can see, but for those who believe, who can't seem to see past the system and think that its existence is permanent, to take this lesson that the system of colonial capitalism and the contradictions that come from it is not a permanent situation. And you can just take that from the Battle of St. Peter 96 to the struggles happening around the world. This system, the time is ticking for it. And that's what we have a responsibility in St. Pete, to never let TyRon Lewis's name disappear from our memories, and including those who are just coming in to the city. And we have to remind people of what is possible when the people are organized under revolutionary leadership. This is what we're capable of.
I asked Akilé whether she thinks St. Petersburg will see another period like the 8 years of not a single African person being murdered by the police that we saw after the murder of TyRon Lewis.
I think that we have to, obviously I won't be able to, tell the future, but I do think that in a way we can, tell where the situation is going in the world based on where the place of, where the system is currently. And we look around the world today, and colonized people, oppressed people around the world are rising up and, are declaring that, the days of the system are numbered. Colonial capitalism, U.S. imperialism, it's, the U.S. is not the superpower that it was, that it's on its last leg. And with the continued efforts of revolutionary political leadership, I do believe that the state will be under intense pressure. It's obviously under intense scrutiny, but under a serious pressure. And in a dying system of imperialism, it does lash out. It is violent, and it will do everything it can to sustain itself. But it does have to be, on its toes. In terms of being able to function in the same old way, being able to come into our community, kill us with impunity. It has to, reconsider all of that. And in the event that an African is murdered by the police, that, putting the police on trial, and and coming up with indictments and things like that. That's something that at one point the system didn't have to consider. It was just another dead nigga, and that was it. And but that can't happen anymore. That is not possible. And we see that. We see it because African people are rising up after the murder of George Floyd in the summer of 2020. And obviously we saw it in 96. So I think that we are going to increasingly run into a situation where the state, the colonial capitalist state, is going to and already has begun the process of, having to function totally differently based on the pressure coming from the people. But if we intend for there to be another 8-year stretch and longer, not one more African life stolen at the hands of the colonial capitalist system, it's going to be on us to, organize in our communities, organize the people, winning them as we did in 96, and prior to that, winning them to the understanding of, what it is we're confronted with, what the system is, defining who our enemies are, defining who the colonial capitalist state is and what their function is, winning the people to our own independence, our own interests, the demand for self-determination, winning us to turn our backs against the system, that we will be able to apply an intense amount of pressure, on the system to, and that, that's what we're talking about here is a coming together of, African worker state power, being able to control what happens in our communities, our own destinies, and being and seizing power so that no one can come into our communities and harm any of our people without consequence. And that's what it's going to take for African people to not have to live under this haunting presence of fear all the time, not knowing when the day might be our last, and if coming in contact with a police officer at any point during our day will result in our death. So that's what it's going to require, and I think that's how we confidently can say, yes, there will be a period of time where African people won't experience this anymore, but it's going to require revolutionary organization, leadership, which we have, and to seize power. That's what it's going to take.
Like so many other victims of police murder, TyRon Lewis was subjected to a second death, as it's called in the media, a second death of slander. I asked Director Akilé to tell us what she wants people to know about the person that TyRon Lewis was, who he was in terms of his legacy, his family, and his community.
Yeah, I really want to just emphasize what you just stated about the media, the colonial bourgeois media, and that when they put the yellow tape, when they start putting the yellow tape around, a murder scene when African people have been, killed by the police, or, the people that they let in outside of the police are the media. They let the media vans in, and they start working together to get their story straight, and to be able to paint a narrative about what has just occurred. And and that's what happened in '96, and what continues to happen. That they attempt to define, what has just taken place, and it's always a situation of slander, where they're attacking the victim, where they're attacking the African community, are attacking our parents, things like that, to be able to explain and justify the death of TyRon Lewis and countless other Africans who've been murdered by this system. And so that's just an important note to make about, the functioning of the media and journalism, and this whole idea that things are non-biased or unbiased, things like that. I mean, it's in total collaboration with the state. They are the state themselves, in a sense that they carry out, this assault on our community, and wage this type of war of ideas on our people. So. I think that people have to know about TyRon Lewis, and we've been saying it throughout this interview, that TyRon Lewis inspired, with the political leadership of the Uhuru Movement. The thing that distinguishes the murder of TyRon Lewis is the African working class and what we did following the murder, and want to say just towards his family, who has been fighting for 25 years, who consistently comes out to actions. His sister Deanne Lewis, who constantly has just been vocal and is standing with the Uhuru Movement over these last years. Didn't take a check, from anyone, hush money, nothing. I mean, just stood courageously. This African working class family has stood courageously this whole time, and has denounced the system over and over again. Because so many times, you see these families who have just been devastated by the loss of, have mothers burying their children, and we are. They send these sellouts into our communities, and they have those Africans go up in front of the whole world, in front of the media, and apologize, or to say we forgive, and this family never did such a thing. I mean, you have we were just out with his family, his mother, Deanne, on the anniversary of the 25th anniversary of his death, and they're as outspoken as ever, and I think that's who we have to raise up, that family. We have to demand reparations to that family, reparations with interest. 25 years has gone by since the murder of TyRon Lewis, that family has had to deal with, suffer from the loss of that, a member of their family and a member of our community. So I think we have to remember and uphold, when we remember TyRon Lewis, we have to uphold that family, wrap our arms and support and embrace that family. And, we have to, we just have to continue to organize, and and make sure that the name of TyRon Lewis and what happened with the African working class in 96, that memory does not die. That's what we have to do.
I want to express profound appreciation for Director of Agitation and Propaganda, Akilé Anai, for joining me today on Reparations in Action for this important discussion about TyRon Lewis and the Battle of St. Pete.
Uhuru.
You're listening to Reparations in Action.
Reparations now!
This has been an episode of Reparations in Action, the White Lies Shattered series, a biased podcast of white solidarity with Black power. My name is Jamie Simpson. This episode was engineered by Marcel Marius, who also composed our theme music. The show is researched and produced by Penny Hess, Jesse Neville, and Lisa Watson from the Black Power 96.3 FM studio in St. Petersburg, Florida. A shout out to Akilé Anai and DJ Eddie Maltzby, as well as the entire Reparations in Action team, Sandra Forrest, Johan Bedingfield, Amanda Carlozzi, Kyle Weiss, Marissa Ricchetti, Ali Aiello, Alana Woods, Declan Keller, Hallie Murray, and Sarah Rittersbach. If you liked what you heard today, you can go to Apple Podcasts and rate this podcast. If you have questions, comments, suggestions, please email them to us at ria@blackpower96.org. Special thanks to the African People's Socialist Party's chairman Omali Yeshitela, without whose leadership and theory of African internationalism, none of the understandings presented on Reparations in Action would be possible. Thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week.